Welcome, everybody, to another edition of A Conversation With here on Severe MMA. I am E. Spencer Kyte, and I am honored to be joined by my first fellow Canadian to make an appearance on the show, Aaron Bronsteter. He is a award-nominated mixed martial arts reporter for TSN here in our home country of Canada. Aaron, thank you for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I looked at the time that you asked me to be on this originally at like 9 a.m. Eastern, which is 6 a.m. your time. And now we're actually doing this at 10:30 my time, which is 7:30 your time. So I appreciate your commitment to this craft.
So in working with a Irish outlet, as I do here with Severe, many of our people, obviously there's an 8-hour time difference between myself and most of my colleagues. And so I'm a morning person. Generally, my alarm goes off at 5:30. I get up, I start my day. And so early morning East Coast is fine to me. I'm good. It's when people are like, hey, can we do a hit at, and it gets into 10 o'clock my time in the evening, then we're starting. I'm getting to be an old man. I can't be doing the late nights, but I could do the early mornings. So I appreciate you carving out some time before you take your well-earned holiday hiatus from doing media and covering things. Thank you, man.
Yeah, no problem. This is my last day on the job, like at least full day on the job, because I will be watching Ryzen and Bellator. But other than that, this is it. So you got me at the right exactly the right time.
Perfect. I love it. We'll start as we always do. When did you fall in love with combat sports?
The first real moment for me was the Rampage and Chuck Liddell rematch, the one in the UFC. That's really when I became exposed to the sport. And I mean, I'm a lot later than a lot of my colleagues in terms of my introduction, but that was really when I started to invest in the sport and start to watch it a lot more. I was a big basketball guy. When I got into sports media, I really wanted to do something in basketball. But then once I discovered mixed martial arts, I just fell in love with it. And, to the point where I was watching Dream overnight on HDNet, like really obsessed with the sport. So that really started to shift my attention towards mixed martial arts, which was such a new sport. It was really in its embryonic phase. And I figured that was a good time to really get into it because I could be on the ground floor of a brand new sport and see how far it would go. And of course, now it's up there with the major sports organizations in North America.
So that sort of later, as you framed it, introduction or sort of entry to it is a point I wanted to touch on. It's a point so I know a little bit about your obvious journey into this and through some of the sports media that you've done prior to this in terms of different roles at TSN and things like that. It's super commendable to me. Like, as you said, you came into this a little later than some people. Your depth of knowledge and your ability to, as you said, just soak in everything and your desire to soak in everything is super commendable to me. And a thing that I think young journalists and people that are looking to get into this field, following your footsteps, do similar things to you, should really take heed of and really pay attention to. What was it about this sport that gave you that? Or is that just the way you are of, if I'm in on something, I'm going all in and I'm getting HD, as you said, I'm watching Dream, I'm watching everything, because like you'll drop knowledge about kickboxers that are, doing their thing in glory when there are people in this industry that don't know much outside of the UFC. So where does that thirst for information come from?
Yeah, it's kind of the latter. I'm just an all-in kind of guy. If you watch me on social media when I talk about music, like every Friday,
we'll get there.
Yeah, I'm on my streaming services looking at what's new and listening to things and seeing what grabs my attention. I can only have a certain amount of interest in my life because I become so invested in them. Like right now with basketball, if you asked me to name like 5 players on the Los Angeles Clippers, I probably couldn't. Right. But like if you would have asked me 15 years ago, I could have told you all their stat lines. I could have told you who they drafted the last 10 years. Like I had to kind of give something up in order to take something new on. And that's kind of how my brain works. So with mixed martial arts, and the reason why I dove a little bit into kickboxing as well is because it kind of grabbed me. Like I said, with music, like when I watched jiu-jitsu and amateur wrestling and, really any of the other martial arts dialects, they don't really grab me quite as much. Like I probably should start watching Karate Combat because I feel like that would be something I'd be interested in. It's just a matter of time, like finding the time to do it.
Right.
But I got into Glory Kickboxing like probably 10 plus years ago or whenever it really started to come on. I was watching it whenever it was on, and long before I even started covering mixed martial arts. So I've just kind of stuck with that.
So let's get to covering mixed martial arts. Obviously, you went to school for communications, broadcast communications, wanting to be in the media industry. Where did that, let's start at the impetus of that. Where did that come from? Did you know from an early age, early on, that sports media was something you wanted to do?
Yeah, see, it's funny. I went in for business communications, and the reason why I went in for
Right.
business communications is because that was kind of the crossroads I was at. Is I was either going to go the business route, go into marketing or copywriting or something along those lines, or I was going to go the media route. But from when I was a kid, I was recording my own radio shows with friends on tape recorders, and I was, making mixtapes by recording radio shows and listening to radio shows. And you know, the broadcasters that I was really into when I was younger were like Howard Stern and the DJs that kind of throw to songs and tell stories along
Right.
the way. And that's what my exposure to broadcasting was. And then when I became a basketball fan, like got really into basketball, and that was at a pretty young age, I was like, wow, I could do broadcasting and mix it with sports. And that's where I started to go in that direction. But I was also looking at music journalism and music broadcasting because those were my interests. So I kind of just followed along those paths. And then once I graduated from Brock University, I got an honors degree in business communications. I was like, I had applied for some post graduate diplomas in marketing and copywriting, and then also in journalism, broadcasting, etc., and had to just kind of make that choice. But it was pretty clear from my time at university, where I was spending so much time volunteering for newspapers and television and
Calling
radio.
basketball games,
Yeah, calling
if I'm not
basketball games.
mistaken.
Yeah, I was calling basketball games for the local television. I guess it was the community television station. I was like, this is what I enjoy doing more. I actually did an internship one summer with a copywriting marketing company, and like a pretty big one in Canada. And I was like, you know what, this isn't for me. I saw how the people there were, that it was kind of a punch the clock for a lot of them. And I was like, I don't think this is where I want to go. So I went into media, and like we talked about earlier, I'm very all in. So, it was very apparent to my teachers or professors in college that this was going to be something I was going to excel at. I really did whatever I could to stand out among the crowd. And I think that they really appreciated that and saw that I had the drive and ambition to do this professionally.
So you started, as many people do, as they make the entry into media, behind the scenes. You did some production work. I know you were on the MMA show with Mauro Ranallo, our good friend, and fellow Canadian. Shouts to Mauro always. Various other things. You were at the Score. You moved to TSN. You were doing talent relations for Off the Record, which if anybody doesn't know, and listen, this is an Irish web platform, so people probably don't know. It was basically an interview show hosted by Michael Landsberg, one of the more prominent sports media members here in our country. And you would book guests and have people on. Who was the most memorable guest that you booked? Or is it from the experience of booking them or how the show turned out?
It took me a couple of, like, probably about 6 months to a year to book Donald Trump before he was president.
Wow.
He was on the show. I'm trying to think of, like, we had the who's who. Like, we had
Oh,
Kobe
it was
Bryant
crazy.
on.
It was a great show.
We had so many different guests on over the years that did Off the Record. I can't even keep track. Like, we have a spreadsheet somewhere of all of the different guests that we booked. And I have a huge amount of pride for doing that job. I was behind the scenes more than I was on air. If you look
Right.
at the totality of my career, it's probably about, I think it's 13 or 14 years behind the scenes as a producer or guest booker. And then since, I think it was UFC 206 was the first UFC that I kind of covered on my own for TSN. So I'm still kind of a baby in this sport. I feel like until we get to like UFC 306, that I'm still going to consider myself to be still pretty young in this profession.
So let's talk about that move to forward facing. Was it something that you aspired to do? Was it something that was, hey, if you want to try this, go ahead? Did you pursue it? How did that come about? Because it's not a thing that necessarily happens for a lot of people. A lot of people that are behind the scenes remain behind the scenes. A lot of people that are in front of the camera very early on make that push of, I want to be in front of the camera, so I'm going to work my way up the ranks, but in front of the camera. How did Aaron Bronsteter, as we know him today, come about?
It's really funny because you mentioned Michael Landsberg, and Michael was one of the most generous people with his time that I've ever met. Like students would come in and talk to him all the time about wanting to become an on-air personality or do media. He was always willing to speak to anybody. There were people that used to call his office that were having like mental health struggles. They would just call the receptionist at CTV and they'd patch him through to Michael, and Michael would be on the phone for an hour. And I'd go into his office and go, "Who is that?" And he goes, "I don't know. They just called because they were having, issues right now." Like that's just the kind of, special guy he was. But whenever he had people come in that wanted to be in sports media, he said, if you want to be on air, you need to make that your sole 100% focus. Don't think about doing any other jobs, because if you do, you'll just end up doing another job in the industry, and that's fine. But if you want to do on air, that's got to be your sole focus. For me, it ended up being the opposite. It ended up kind of going against that advice. So when we had the UFC rights at TSN, I kept going to my bosses, and this was when like Connor and Ronda were like in their heyday. And I kept saying to my bosses, like, we need to send somebody to go and cover this. Like we should send Michael. We should send one of our Sports Center anchors. Like there's all these big things happening in the sport right now, and we're airing it, and we should really, elevate this because it's getting really big. And I would just keep going and talking to my bosses about it. And then my VP one day was just like, you should do it. You have so much passion about the sport. You keep coming and talking to me about it. And if you've met me, I'm not a shy person. So I was not worried at all about taking it on. I was like, okay, cool, let's go. And because I was kind of doing it my own way, I was able to come up with thankfully the person that sat next to me at TSN, who I worked with on Off the Record, was in charge of the kind of technical side of, the reporter end of TSN in terms of the equipment and all of that. So from the jump, we didn't hire a camera guy for me. I was setting up the camera, and still.
So I want to get into this. I want to get into this because it's something I didn't know until I started doing research. Because obviously I'm Canadian. I have friends that have worked at TSN. I have friends that have been on air. All of those different things. My expectation, my thought was, Aaron rolls in. It's probably going to be like Junkie was back in the day, right? Aaron and his camera guy. So you would have your own Ken Hathaway. Shouts to Cold Coffee. No, it's Aaron, his iPhone, and that's it. And you're doing the filming, you're doing the editing, you're shipping everything. Like you are a one-man show. And I could not have more respect for that hustle, because I couldn't do it.
Well, you're simplifying it a little bit. There's also lighting, and there's a tripod, and there's microphones and gear.
You're leaving a whole bunch of stuff that I do out, dipshit.
Yeah, and that was one of the things about the job that was the most nerve-wracking for me early on, and it was actually kind of good because it would distract me from the actual on-air part of it. Is everything functioning? Is it framed properly? Is all of those different things were more concerning to me, because that wasn't my area of expertise compared to actually standing in front of somebody and talking. I talk to people every day. I took a lot of pressure off of myself by having to focus on that and worry about that. And thankfully now, with the technology that we have, front-facing cameras are really good quality. Right now I'm using a front-facing camera when I'm talking to you, with a microphone plugged in and some lighting. But back then I always hated using the front-facing camera because the quality wasn't as good as the rear-facing camera. So what I used to do was I would frame the shot on an Apple Watch. I would zoom it in and I would frame it and focus it on an Apple Watch so that I could use the rear-facing camera, and I could make sure that it was recording by looking at my watch and seeing that it was actually recording at the time. So thankfully, I've been able to simplify it a little bit more, and that way I can kind of glance over the camera and see if it's recording so that I don't lose anything. And even still to this day, on this last trip, I lost parts of interviews because of technology messing up. So that part of the job will always be a thorn in my side, but the amount of money that it saves makes it a lot more palatable for me to travel to all of the different major events in North America, because one of the major expenses is cut back upon.
First and foremost, it is amazing that you're able to do all of that. And anybody listening, anybody watching that wants to get into this field, and I know yourself, you would advocate for it. I know our fellow Canadian James Lynch advocates for it. Learn how to do as many things as possible so that you can eliminate some of those expenses, as you said, because in this industry, money decides everything. And if you can say, look, I don't need a cameraman because I can shoot it, I can cut it, I can do all of this stuff, it's going to increase not only your value, but the possibilities of getting to do some of these things. It is one of my deep regrets as a 44-year-old who doesn't know how to do any of this stuff yet. and is slowly trying to figure some of it out, that I don't have that, because it is, as I see and as we know now, super valuable.
For sure. And I'm 40, so I had to learn all this stuff as well. I'm not a spring chicken either. And if you need any advice, feel free to hit me up
I will
anytime.
definitely do that.
But
So
it's a big part of like you mentioned, it just gives a lot of flexibility in terms of what I'm able to do. And I also like kind of overseeing it myself, because then I don't have to rely on another person. I know that sounds bad, but
no,
I
hey,
also know that if something messes up, it's kind of on me.
right.
I always hate it when someone else does something that I couldn't have controlled. I don't know if that makes me a bit of a control freak, but if something gets messed up where it's out of my control, it annoys me a little bit more, because there's nothing I could have done about it.
Right. It's one of those, oh, why couldn't you have just done it right? I understand. Before we continue on in MMA, you have stacks of vinyl behind you. We talked about the music a little bit already, and your social media sort of expressing. And earlier this week, you did the like, look, I've got a few days. What are the albums that I missed? Everybody hit me with stuff. And it is a diverse range of musical tastes. Where was that cultivated? Was it just as you said, like, I want to try everything and we'll see what sticks? Because it is, I mean, when we talk about people that do the like, oh, I like everything, you like everything. There are fingers in all of the pies and all of the genres. Where did that foster? Where was that developed?
Well, I do have some blind spots. Like I only have a select knowledge of country music, select knowledge of metal. I don't listen to any classical music for the most part. So really, again, it's just being open-minded. When I was younger, back when we were downloading stuff on LimeWire and MP3s and on IRC and all of that, and it took forever to download songs, I would still have a real curiosity about discovering new music. And that's still, even to this day, a big thing for me, is just discovering new stuff and listening to new stuff all the time. And I think that I read an article, I think it was like at age 37 is when you just stop, like whatever music you're into at that age is usually like what you will continue to listen to for the rest of your life. Like people kind of, there's like a cutoff. I don't know if it's 37, but
Sounds
there's an
about
age.
right. Yeah, sounds about
where
right for me.
You stop being interested in finding new stuff and you just rely on the old music that you're into. And I'm texting with Brian Campbell all the time and giving him recommendations, but like he'll send me recommendations and I'm like, I'll try to get to it, but like I'm trying to stay on top of all the new stuff. Like he's sending me like Billy Cobham albums from like 1977, and I'm like, yeah, I should go back and listen to it. It's probably great, but like I'm so consumed in making sure that I'm not missing any gems from the year that it takes a lot of my time. And like this is one of how many shelves do I have? These are the 4x4s. I've got one more 4x4, and then I've got two more 2x8s that are just full of records, like it's just tons of records. So that's what I spend a lot of my time on from a hobby standpoint. Like I'm a record hobbyist, and I'm just always looking to buy and sell stuff, and I'm having fun with that. That's like my escape is music.
You're in a good city for it. You're in a good city for it, for being able to go crate hunting. What was it like during the pandemic when you can't get out and necessarily get like I will go and pour through crates just to look and see and find little gems and little, you find the thing that's $2 that you're like, this is great. How is this only $2 at the used record store? What was it like for you when that was sort of taken away for a little bit?
I just pivoted to online. Like that's,
I gotta feed the need. Let's keep looking.
And even still, like I live far enough from Toronto that it's like an inconvenience for me to go to record stores. It's like probably the closest record store to me, I guess, in Toronto is probably like 35, 40 minutes away. So it inconveniences me enough that I can't like just go record shopping whenever. I try to do it mostly when I'm on the road. When I'm traveling for the UFC, if there's like a couple hours downtime, and my thing when I go to Vegas, because of the time change, Zia Records there is open till 10 p.m., which is like the equivalent of 1 a.m. here.
Right.
So on my first night there, I'll usually go to Zia Records until 10 so that I can adjust to the time.
Acclimate. Smart. Yeah. See, again, anybody watching this, anybody listening to this that wants tips, that needs smart idea, here you go. The man is a font of knowledge for this pursuit. Favorite unknown band. And unknown is in quotes, obviously, like there's degrees to unknown, but your favorite, give people somebody to listen to, go and seek it out. You have to hear these people. To quote Natalie Portman, we'll fill in the blank, will change your life.
Well, this new band from this year called Anxious is a band that I've really enjoyed. Their album would be in my top 5 from this year, and I saw them twice this year. I haven't. I think I've only gone to 3 concerts this year, and 2 of them was
Two of them were
Anxious
that. All
opening for
right.
Oso Oso. So they were like the first band on a bill of 3 playing to, in Toronto, there were maybe 300, 400 people at the show. So we're talking that. I guess that's pretty unknown, right? Like
Yep,
they're
that's
the
pretty
opener.
unknown.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's the band that I really have grabbed onto this year that I'd say are pretty unknown in terms of the overall music spectrum.
Okay. And is there a favorite? And again, this is in quotes, crappy band. That band that everybody would just be like, really? Them? You celebrate their entire catalog?
I guess that's subjective. I mean, Ween
Right.
is an acquired taste. I love Ween. Like that's one of my like favorite cult, like kind of cult following bands. But I mean, they're pretty big though.
Yeah.
Like they'll play
And
big
like there aren't
venues.
people that are running around being like, oh my God, I can't believe you listened to Ween.
But if you put on The Pod for somebody that didn't know them, they'd think it was like
True.
the worst album ever.
True.
So I mean, I guess that's why I picked them, is because a lot of their early stuff is just like unpalatable for
Right.
people
Fair.
that are getting into music. So and they're a band like one of my favorite bands. So it's like,
All right.
so I'd go with that. And there's also like Wesley Willis. Like I love Wesley Willis, but Wesley Willis is like, kind of, I don't know if it would be almost like the comedy genre of music. So
Right.
that would be one that I'd go to
All right.
also.
Fair enough. So you mentioned records, music, one of your hobbies. Are there others, or is that like we do work, we do family, we have the one hobby, and this is all I can do because I am deep dive all the way in all the time?
And that's about it. I find some time to play Oculus here and there, and that's about what my day goes to. It's like family, music, MMA, and then like I'll exercise on the Oculus for like an hour a day, maybe
Fair
45
enough.
minutes.
I understand. We will dive back into the MMA side of things. This past weekend, you had the opportunity to call the fights or be a part of the broadcast team at Unified MMA 48. What was that experience like?
It was one of the most fun nights of my entire life. I had such a blast doing that. And it was a bucket list thing for me. Like I had called those basketball games back in the day on like, again, community television. This is like a global platform on UFC Fight Pass.
Right.
It's the sport that I love. I got to do it alongside 2 awesome guys, Mike Malott and John Ramdeen. I've known Ramdeen for several years, but him and I haven't really connected over the last couple of years because he's mostly focusing on commentary now. So it was such an awesome experience. I hope to do it again. I had so much fun doing it, and getting to meet the athletes and learn more about them and relay their stories on the broadcast. It was just such a delight. I wish I could do it every weekend. It was so great.
So one of the things that I have here in my notes that I want to talk to you about, because of and this feels like the right foray into it, Unified has done. So they did back-to-back shows last weekend. They did a show the weekend before that. They, to me, feel like one of the preeminent organizations in the country, one of the few truly that are running events pretty regularly. Battlefield out here does about one a month, one every 6 to 8 weeks. But then there's not a lot of others. You and I both remember when MMA came of age here and we had the flourishing of promotions and everybody wanted to be involved for a minute, and then it has receded. What to you are some of the barriers or the hindrances to a flourishing sort of grassroots regional circuit here in Canada?
Well, I'd say the pandemic set us back probably 5 years.
For sure.
Like I think that it's going to be a long time before we see any Canadians really come onto the scene and make some noise and contend for a championship, just because they had nowhere to go. Like we're talking about 2 years where they could continue training, but there were so few opportunities unless you were willing to travel outside of Canada, like an Aaron Jeffrey was. Like I think Aaron Jeffrey's a good success story because he went and did Contender Series and then also went to CFFC and he stayed busy, did Bellator. But there are not a whole lot of those stories, really. And then you've got guys that signed to one championship and can't get fights, like Dustin Johnson, Arjun Buller is barely like getting any. He's the champion there, and he's barely getting any fights. So I think that right now the Canadian regional scene and Canadian mixed martial arts is really kind of at a low point, which is difficult to see. It's not that the talent's not there. It's just that a lot of them are either A, rusty, or B, haven't had the opportunity to shine on a really big stage. And I think that is, when you say barrier of entry, that's the definition really of a barrier of entry. And if you look at how many Canadians have signed to the UFC in the last 3 years, probably can count them almost on one hand.
Do you think one of the things I often think about is there seems to be, for whatever reason, and some of it is just financial, there's a lack of sort of cross-provincial booking. A lot of times there's a lack of Canadians getting opportunities south of the border. You mentioned Aaron Jeffrey, Johan Linnaeus went down to CFFC as well. There are sporadic times that it happens. Do you feel like that's part of the struggle and part of the challenge, is that a lot of these regional promotions are just that, they are regional? And so it's not necessarily about bringing in the guy from Quebec or the guy from British Columbia to come and fight in Texas or wherever it may be. That's sort of because we don't have a plethora of events up here that is hampering Canadian development as well.
Yeah, and I think it's starting to pick up, but there's a lot that goes into getting a fight south of the border. Like, you need your visa, you need to travel there, there's a lot of expenses involved, to the point where when you're done fighting, you're making probably $500 if you're lucky. You're pocketing that amount. So it's a very difficult thing for people to commit to, because a lot of these guys still have full-time jobs, where that's what they're dedicating their time and their resources to. So, I do love seeing a lot of these teams that are coming up, like Niagara Top Team are building so many good talents right now that I think will ultimately get to the UFC, but I think it's going to take some time. So I think there is some promise, but again, I think that the pandemic really set things back.
Do you feel, or I will just give you the open-ended of what impact does a couple of years with the pandemic of the UFC not being here, and with, I would say over the last several years, UFC events in Canada have declined a little bit in terms of popularity, in terms of attendance, many would say in terms of quality. What impact do you think that has on things as well?
You mean the actual cards in Canada?
Yeah, the events that we've had in Canada. Like, it feels for a while there was a big push and there was a big mixed martial arts was a big thing. And now it feels like it's waned a little bit as sort of the UFC investment and focus on Canada has slipped a little.
Well, I wouldn't say that the events in Canada were lackluster. I think that there were some really good
Nor
cards in
would
Canada.
I.
Yeah.
But I hear from many people that these cards are terrible.
Yeah, but they're
I
attended,
think
right?
they're
Like,
great.
people are going to them, people are showing up, they're still filling them up. So I think the problem is we're so far removed from them at this point that we kind of have to take a wait and see approach on that one. I think we're going to see a Canadian pay-per-view this year. Next year, which starts in a couple of days. But I think 2023, we're going to see probably 3 Canadian events. We'll probably see 2 fight nights and 1 pay-per-view, hopefully. And if that happens, then let's see what the kind of response is. I think that we're still going to see sold-out houses no matter what they put out. But I think it's going to revitalize the scene. I think one of the problems is, when up-and-coming prospects are able to go to events and kind of see it and live it, I think that's really what kind of gets them into that next gear where they want to eventually dedicate themselves to becoming a UFC fighter.
Any breaking news you want to give us? Any insight that you
If I had it, I'd do it. If I had it, it would be out there already. I mean, I can make you some predictions, but I don't really have anything.
All right, let's go with predictions. This is one of the things I love to do, because obviously you and I both have friends throughout this country that are like, hey, when are they coming to? And there are some places that I'm just like, yeah, it's not going to happen. And there are other places where I'm like, I can't believe they haven't been there yet. So let's play the prediction game. Where does the pay-per-view go?
This might be long-winded, but hear me out. So let's map out 2023 from a pay-per-view perspective.
I love it.
We got Brazil in January, Australia in February. We got 2 pay-per-views in March. So we've got Vegas, like they have every year, and they have the London card at the end of March. April has typically been earmarked for Brooklyn in the past, so I wouldn't be surprised if they're back in Brooklyn in April. So now that leaves us with a couple openings, but let's go to the ones that are tried and true. We got July International Fight Week in Vegas. We've got Abu Dhabi in October. We've got New York in November, and then we've got Vegas again in December. So if you're gonna play the process of elimination game, we're looking at May. We're looking at June. I don't know if they're gonna do 2 in July because they're doing 2 in March. But if they're gonna do 2 in July, then it could be end of July, could be August, and could be September. But that's it. Like, it's gonna be one of those months, and it will probably be in Toronto if I had to guess.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well. My secondary, if it's not Toronto, I think they go back to Edmonton because it has been successful. I know people in Vancouver will be like, what about us? And people in Calgary will be like, hey, we still really need a pay-per-view because the one we had wasn't great. And we were promised for many, many
And
years
don't
that we
forget
would get one.
Montreal. Has been
And
one in
then
like
that's what
8 or
I was
9
going to
years.
say. Like Montreal hasn't had one. Was the last one Demetrius Johnson and Kyoji Horiguchi?
Yep.
Wow. I was at that.
That was the last one.
That was a
And
weird
Dillashaw
show.
was supposed to fight on that card, and it
Dillashaw
fell
was
off.
supposed to fight on that show. That was a weird show.
And it didn't do well.
And it didn't do well.
So I think that's why Montreal has kind of been blacklisted since then.
Right. If we're going to do fight nights, do you have ideas of where we will be with those?
I think major cities. Like, I think you're looking at your Vancouvers, your Calgarys, your Edmontons, your Montreals. I don't think we'll see them in the Maritimes. Like, I don't think we'll see smaller shows this year because I think they want to go to the bigger cities. Like, I don't think you'll see a Halifax or anything along those lines. I think you're just looking at the major city, maybe a Winnipeg. Like, I think you're thinking major cities for a fight night.
Places where there are hockey arenas that they can go and play in, big fan bases, things like that. So maybe you and I will have to have a meal out here in Vancouver if we get one.
Hey, there's no better place to have meals well, maybe Montreal, but other than Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, those are great food cities.
Great food cities. I am going to try to make a commitment to get back to an event in 2023. It has been many years. I promised for years that if the UFC came back to Vancouver, I would travel and head in and see everybody. And then the last time they did, I was on my way to Hawaii and had to say, sorry guys, Hawaii is more important than coming to see Justin Gaethje beat the hell out of Donald Cerrone. I'll catch you next time. See you later.
So yeah, that was a fun card though.
Yeah, it was I mean, look, I
had the Tristan Connolly fight.
What am I gonna do? Right? Like, what am I gonna do? We've been planning a 10-year anniversary, go to Hawaii, like big build up to it. And they were like, hey, September, we're coming to Vancouver. I was like, really, guys? We've had 5 years that we've been waiting to reconnect, and now it happens. One of the other big things you've been working on as of late, and again, all the credit in the world to you for your efforts in this, is the recent situation on the betting side of things with the AGCO and UFC gambling being suspended in various parts of our country. You're somebody who contributes to the TSN Edge side of things, which is their gambling sort of betting side of things. For people that maybe don't understand or haven't thought of this, how big of a story do you think this is, and how big of an impact do you think this situation can have going forward?
I don't think people realize how big of a story this is, and I think that's the issue. I can't think of a single time in my lifetime, and I mean, sports betting's become a lot more mainstream, of course, in recent years, where you just had like Las Vegas pretty much for a long time in terms of single game betting. But we haven't seen a single instance where an entire sport, basically, or an entire promotion, organization, league has been wiped from a sports book. And I think it's an unprecedented situation, and one that is still ongoing in Ontario. Alberta changed their tune on it after the UFC announced the, I guess, penalty for James Krause, or the tentative penalty for James Krause stemming from the situation. I know they said the investigation is still ongoing, so it's a fluid situation. But right now, Ontario is still standing firm in terms of their, I guess, commitment to keeping the UFC out of their sports betting offerings. And from what I understand, it's because the amount of handle that they get on the UFC is similar to the ones that they get for bigger leagues, NBA, MLB. And they feel like the UFC doesn't operate under the same, I guess, rules, for lack of a better word, than the other, maybe structure, as some of the major sports leagues. Like, the major sports leagues have, referees associations, coaches associations, players associations, agent certification.
Right.
The UFC doesn't have any of those things because they operate on an independent contractor basis. So they, from what I've been told, are not happy with the way that it's written into their code of conduct, because it's a little bit loosey-goosey in terms of what they're actually able to do to people that engage in insider betting in the sport.
And so, as somebody that has poured into it and is covering this story, as you said, it is ongoing. Where do you think this goes? What if you had to map out a bit of a timeline or a way back for the UFC? What are your thoughts on how that happens?
I really have no idea. I think if they changed their code of conduct and bolstered it a little bit more, because let's face it, the UFC have the ability to kind of do whatever they want. They've shown this for years, that if they want to ban somebody from the sport, they can ban someone from, maybe not from the sport, but from their events. They can ban someone from their events. They can say, we're not giving you fights. They can say, you're not going to be in the corner. But if it's not written in an ironclad fashion in their code of conduct, I feel like that's what Ontario's waiting to see.
Right.
They want to see exactly what the UFC is going to do to safeguard from these kind of things. And the way Dana White says it when you ask him about it is like, what are we going to do? We're going to suspend you, or we're going to like ban you. The penalty is that like you're going to go to federal prison, right? Like there's not much worse that we can do as a promotion or an entity than what will actually, like the real ramifications of doing this are, right? And he has a point in that regard. Because if you're a coach or whatever, a fighter or whatever, and you're engaging in insider betting, that's like a federal offense. So regardless of what the UFC does to try to protect from that happening, none of the potential outcomes that they can offer are as harsh as the reality of going through the judicial system could end up being.
Right. It's a fascinating story. It's something that I think a lot of people, as you said, don't necessarily recognize or understand the severity of it or potential severity of it and depth of it. I applaud all of your work thus far. Everybody that is interested in it and wants to know what's going on, please follow Aaron, stay on top of it through him. He will continue to do a tremendous job with it as he does everything. Go follow him. He will steer you in the correct directions in terms of this story. It's a story that certainly has some prickliness to it, and you interact with, I should say, on a somewhat regular basis, a guy that can be prickly in Dana White and various other people. You work at TSN, which is a broadcast partner of the UFC. As someone that has spent over a decade trying to balance those two worlds a little bit in terms of contributing to UFC.com, but also being out at other outlets. What has that balancing act been like for you? What is that sort of marriage between working at a broadcast partner, but also just covering the sport and doing your job the way that you see fit, the way that you're instructed to do your job, been like for you?
I think it's been a good balance. With my bosses, they are very confident that whatever I do is going to be utilizing the right judgment. And I feel like I haven't really strayed from that. I think that my reporting has always been fair. It's always been down the middle. And that's what I try to do. I think that when it comes to working with the UFC in terms of their PR team and all that, I think I've got a really good relationship with them. I'm sure I bother them from time to time. But at the same time, I really like everybody that's on their team because they have a job to do. I've got a job to do. And I think that they will do whatever they can to try to make my job easier, really, to the best that they're able to do that. And for me, I just want to cover the sport down the middle. And I also have always said my mandate, outside of course, doing fair and balanced reporting, is to try to grow the sport in Canada. Like I want the UFC and MMA to be big in this country because, and if you look at it from a rating standpoint, from what I understand, it's been on par with like the big days of the UFC, like the Conor McGregor era and the Ronda Rousey era. Like the things are still doing really, really well in terms of the interest in the sport in Canada. And I think the pandemic also helped that as well. I think a lot more people jumped on board to watch the sport and became invested in the sport. Like I know a lot of different family members that have become really invested in the sport in recent years. So I think that that's really what I always try to think of as my mandate is like, is what I'm doing good for the health of the sport in Canada? That's kind of the way that I view it. And I think that really good reporting, whether it's considered to be positive or negative in terms of what it looks like optically for the UFC, is something that people are interested in. So that's the way that I try to look at it is it has to be approached from all sides. I do have to, of course, maintain good relationships with not just the UFC, but everybody in the sport, like whether it's the coaches, the managers, the people on the legislative side. And I feel like I do a really good job of balancing that and doing things in a very fair an equitable way.
So you mentioned the pandemic being a thing that grew some of the audience here in Canada. I will point to yourself as part of what helped grow the audience. It is undefinable to me what quality coverage, what seeing our national sports outlet, our largest sports provider, covering this sport the way that I always wanted it to. I know even before you were forward facing, you and I had some conversations about, oh my God, you should be exactly what you said you were bringing to your bosses of, we should be out here covering this just like everything else. We have these opportunities. You have taken that and run with it and done a phenomenal job. And whether you will accept it, wear it, whatever, your efforts have truly helped grow the sport and the acceptance of the sport in this country. And you should wear that with a great deal of pride.
Well, thank you, man. That means a lot to me. And at the beginning of last year, I have like a couple sheets that are on my wall over there of just goals that I hope to accomplish in the year. And I'm always kind of looking ahead to the next thing and trying to make things bigger and trying to make things better. So I refuse to rest on my laurels. I always try to learn how to do new things and find new ways to spread the message of the sport, because I love the sport. I think that I always say there's the only barrier of entry for people liking mixed martial arts is like, if you can get past the first minute of watching it, then there's the potential for you to be a viewer of it long term. I think that there are always going to be people that are squeamish about the sport. Like my wife, for example, is in that camp. Like she can't watch more than a minute of mixed martial arts. But I think that the people that watch it and are able to enjoy it after watching it for 1 minute, those people are all potential mixed martial arts enthusiasts of the future.
So you mentioned the list of goals. I wonder if one of them for 2022 was awards nominated, because you were very recently nominated for Journalist of the Year, very deservingly so, I will add, at the World MMA Awards that were held in Las Vegas a couple weeks ago now, through Fighters Only. What did that mean to you to get that recognition, to get that? Everybody always makes the joke of like, oh, I'm right. It's I'm just happy to be nominated. But like, I would imagine there's this means something just to be nominated. I mean, listen, never been nominated. If they want to put me in an honorable mention, I will be through the roof. So what was that experience like, and what does that mean to you, given, as you've said here, a little bit of a later entry into it, not necessarily the thing you were focused on, but now here I am amongst the very best in this sport?
Yeah, it meant everything to me. It was, I have my list, and I don't even think it was on my list, but I can tell you a story about my first time covering the World MMA Awards. I was on the red carpet doing interviews, and this was probably my first year of covering the sport. It's probably 6-7 years ago. And I was doing my interviews, and I said to myself, one day I'm going to be nominated for an award here. And until I am, I will be on the red carpet every single year doing interviews, because that's where I'm at in my career. It's like I'm always going to be the one doing the interviews because I'm not nominated for this award. I've got to stay true to my beginnings always. And that's kind of the way that I've always looked at it. And so it was always a long-term goal to be nominated for Journalist of the Year and to be in like the conversation even among the nominees with guys like Ariel Helwani and Sean Al-Shadi, Mike Bond, John Morgan. Like these guys are people that I looked up to when I got into covering the sport. And then even those like Mark Raimondi and Brett Okamoto, like they weren't even nominated. Like these guys are my peers, and they're putting me in the conversation and not those guys, because those guys should be nominated every year. Like they're great at what they do. But like just to get that kind of recognition really meant a lot to me. This is by far the most rewarding year for me professionally. When you look at covering, I guess being on the broadcast team in Unified last weekend, getting the nomination, just so many different things that have really instilled me with the confidence that I'm doing this thing right. And I can't say enough about how great of a year 2022 was for me, not to mention just the gratitude of being able to get back on the road and cover the events regularly after the pandemic. Like I have such an amount of gratitude for this job right now, more than ever in 2022, for all of those reasons that I outlined.
For people keeping track at home, that's 3 out of 5 nominees are Canadian. Just, just going to mention that, just going to throw that out there. Worth noting. Important to keep track of, as Irish outlets like Severe bring in Canadians like myself. you mentioned getting back on the road. How do you make that decision of what events you're going to go to? Obviously, pay-per-views will take some priority because they are the biggest shows of the year. But is it a situation where you just kind of map out the year, look at the year, and figure out what you want to attend and cover?
Typically, the calendar for me is North American based pay-per-views and Canadian events. Like that's basically what the outline is for me going into any given year. Now, I want to see what this London pay-per-view looks like because I wouldn't mind going to that as
Right.
well. But because it's not super expensive to get to London, from Toronto. So I want to take a look at that. But typically, that's my baseline. Is just it's North American pay-per-views and Canadian events.
Mix in the odd city that you want to get to for experience sake. Like if they go back to Austin, get down there for music, or Seattle.
I would love to do that. I mean, I would love to go to both those cities. But also, I'll go to an event if there's like an event in Detroit, like a fight night in Detroit. I'll go to that, or Buffalo, anywhere driving range, Pittsburgh. Like those are other cities that I would probably go and cover events at, just because it's like 4-hour drive sort of thing.
Right. It's a good time to sit in the car and listen to some music.
Yeah, exactly. Podcasts. I destroy podcasts on a weekly basis too. Like that's the other thing that I spend a lot of time listening to. Is I probably listen to like hours of podcasts. And if you've noticed that I talk really fast, it's because I listen to them at 1.75 speed.
This is what I wanted to get into. You mentioned podcasts. My wife and I have this conversation all the time. She'll come into the kitchen. I'll be doing the dishes. I'll be cooking, and she'll be like, "What is it that you have on?" And it's because it's at 1.5 speed. So what is this? You're a
1.75.
1.75. So even quicker than me. Did it take time to get there? Did it take sort of a build? Was it a progress through 1.25, 1.5 up to 1.7? Okay.
It was an ease-in process. And nobody gave me any sort of constructive criticism for this past weekend's unified card except my dad. My dad's like, "You're talking way too fast." So that's going to be on my list for 2023. Slow it down.
So the funny thing to me is I feel like I speak quickly because similar reasons, right? I listen to everything a little bit faster. I'm leery of dead air, but I also know that I take a little bit of pregnant pauses when I speak at times. And so I feel like I speak really quickly, and my wife will listen to stuff or watch stuff back every so often, catch a glimpse of something and be like, "You take too many pauses and you're too slow in your delivery." And I'm like, that's the opposite of my own self-critique. So I have to start talking at 1.75. There you go. What else is on that list if you want to divulge some of the goals and targets for 2023 for you?
I haven't made it yet, so I don't really have a good answer for you.
10 days.
Yet. Yeah, I'll let you know. Days. Yeah, I'll probably do it actually when I get back from vacation. That's when I'll sit down and kind of hammer out those goals.
All right. We'll get you out of here on some quick hitters, hopefully some fun ones. You mentioned getting into it, the Rampage Chuck rematch kind of thing. Favorite fighter as you got into this, or favorite fighter all time, if there is one?
Probably all time would be Anderson Silva, like prime Anderson Silva. But people always think I'm lying when I say Charles Oliveira was like one of my favorite fighters for the last like 10 years. Just watching the way he fights and his creativity and how he's able to lock up these submissions out of nowhere. I've been such a big fan of how Charles Oliveira fights for such a long time that now that he had this crazy run to becoming a champion, people don't really believe me.
Right.
But that's their problem because I have receipts if people need them.
Right. See, that's me with Max Holloway. I go all the way back to like Max starting his run of 13 or 14 in a row, whatever it was, before he lost. And I was like, no. Going into the Will Chope fight, I was telling you that you needed to pay attention to this guy. Me and Max right hard. Saw those two fight each other actually in Canada, which was one of the weirdest main events in UFC history. A Hawaiian and a Brazilian in
That's
Saskatchewan.
What I'd love to see them run back.
Yeah. Do that again. That would be a great fight to do again.
Do it in Sasky. Actually, don't. It was cursed. Don't do it in Sasky again.
It was cursed. It was a weird event. If there is a fighter that you have been high on that failed to meet expectations, so has there been anybody that you were like, I'm certain that this person is going to go on to do great things, that came up short? And then the inverse of that, somebody that you thought, I just don't see it, that went on to do great things?
There are a lot of people on that first list. Off the top of my head, Jimmy Hedis, Tom Duquesnoy. Who else would there be? There's a lot of fighters. I'm like,
Yeah.
that guy's going to be champion one day, and then they just flame out.
Jimmy Hedis, shout
Mike
out to
Easton.
Jimmy.
I thought Mike Easton would be like a champion one day.
Yep.
Yeah, we're going back. Like,
Yep.
this is when I was able to watch it through the eyes of being a fan.
All of those guys were on
right?
my list as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some others. Like, I'm trying to think of. I don't know. I'm trying to think of just off the top of my head of who I thought was going to be a champion one day that just like barely made it into the top 15, because there's a long list of them.
Oh,
a lot of them are WEC guys too, because I love the
Yep.
WEC. Now, in terms of ones that I didn't see much in that got to the championship level. I guess Leon Edwards, I didn't think he'd be the champion, but I mean, I always knew he was good.
Right.
But I thought he was very beatable.
Right.
Let me think.
And he was for almost 24 minutes.
Yeah. But and no disrespect to the guy. The guy's an
Yeah,
awesome fighter.
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of some others that have become champions. I always thought Juliana Pena was good, so I can't really say her. I wouldn't say that I had written her off going into the Nunes fight, but I certainly didn't think that she was going to win. I don't think anybody did really.
Right.
Trying to think of some other people that have become champion. Like, the thing is, to become a champion, you have to be pretty elite. Like, it's hard to kind of fake it. Yeah. I mean, Jan Błachowicz, I think, is a good example. Like, I thought he was a very middling light heavyweight for some time, and he really picked his game up to the elite level late in the game. So he's probably a great example of somebody that I thought was like, yeah, he's very beatable.
Who are some of the people right now that stand out to you as names to watch, fighters to watch going forward, whether it just be this year coming or the next couple of years?
I think Aaron Blanchfield is going to make a lot of noise. I mean, these are fairly obvious answers, and people that are on a lot of people's radars. I'd have to just kind of like think of a bunch of different prospects that are doing big things. I'm trying to think if there's anybody that's like way off the radar that I'm like, yeah, that person. So I'll look like a genius when we go back like 7 years from now and watch this video.
Bring this back in a bunch of years, and we've got random names.
Yeah, let me try to think of a random name. I'm trying to think if there's somebody that I could. I mean, like Mohamed Mokayev will probably be a champion, but again, like these are fairly, these are really under the radar picks.
Right. Fair enough. I'll let you go on a prospect that definitely isn't under the radar. Actually, we'll do two here. Bo Nickel, top 5 fighter in the next 3 years, or no?
Oh, for sure. Like I'm incredibly confident that he'll be a top 5 guy in the next 3 years.
All right. And then Raul Rojas Jr., does he break John Jones's record? The date is Tuesday, June 6th, 2028. Will he be a champion before then?
I'm going to say no. And it's not a knock on him. I think he's really good, but that division is just so stacked. Like, I mean, if he was like a woman's flyweight, I'd say, oh, yeah, for sure.
Right.
But I mean, the bantamweight division
wins, and he's
the
looking
most
at
killers
a
of any division.
Right. I also think he's probably going to have to move up at some point as he continues to grow into that body. He's already big for that division. And so to go from bantamweight to featherweight, it's still
no cakewalk either.
Yeah, it's not an easy shift. Listen, man, I appreciate you jumping in this morning and doing this. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a wonderful vacation. Before I let you leave, let everybody know where they can follow the tremendous work that you do.
www.aaron.report has every single link you could need for my work. So I got this domain name just so that I can shout it out at the end of interviews like this and make it easy on people to find my work.
Perfect. It is the way to go. He is Aaron Bronsteter. I am Spencer Kyte. This has been a conversation for SevereMMA. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.